They knew it could fail, and yet they launched it. 7 people were on board, and none of them knew that something had already gone wrong. If you think this was an accident, keep reading, because it wasn't that simple. It was January 28, 1986. The whole world was watching. For the first time in history, an ordinary teacher, not an astronaut, not an engineer, a public school teacher from New Hampshire, was going into space. Christa McAuliffe had been selected from over 11,000 applicants. An ordinary teacher has going into space. That turned that mission into something bigger. But there was a problem, something small, almost invisible, and someone had already spoken up about it before. His name was Roger Boisjoli, an engineer at Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the Space Shuttle's booster rockets. A man of numbers, calculations, and precise technical reports. He wasn't the type to panic. He was the type to measure things before speaking, and in July 1985, 6 months before launch, he measured, and he became afraid. What Boisjoli had discovered involved a part called an O-ring, a simple, almost mundane rubber sealing ring responsible for sealing the joints between the segments of the booster rockets. The problem was a detail that any physicist could explain in 30 seconds. In the cold, that part stopped working as it should. Boisjoli wasn't speculating. He had data. He had records from previous missions where the O-rings had already shown erosion under moderately cold conditions. There were photographs, there were measurements, there was a clear, documented, traceable pattern. He wrote an internal memo. Direct, technical, without drama. He said there was a risk of catastrophic failure if the temperature at launch was below what the tests had approved. He said the crew's lives could be in danger. He asked that the flight program be suspended until the problem was resolved. The report was sent and ignored.
The problem was never a lack of warning. It was a choice.
This kind of decision happens more often than you might think, and almost always. No one notices until it's too late. NASA was behind schedule, way behind. The Space Shuttle program had suffered repeated cancellations over the previous months. There was pressure from Congress. There was pressure from the White House. Ronald Reagan was set to deliver the State of the Union address that night, and there were plans, unconfirmed but circulating internally, to mention the teacher in space live during the speech. The mission had become a political event as well as a scientific one, and political events have a schedule. Canceling yet again meant negative headlines. It meant questions about the agency's budget. It meant questions that no one inside NASA wanted to answer at that moment, and that mission had to happen.
When the schedule becomes the priority, safety becomes a detail.
The night before the launch, the warning was repeated. It was late at night on January 27th. A conference call was convened between engineers from Morton Thiokol and NASA managers. The forecast temperature for the following morning at Cape Canaveral was -1 degree Celsius, the lowest ever recorded for any launch in the program. Boisjoli and his colleagues reiterated their concern. They presented the data again. They formally requested that the launch be postponed. On the other end of the line, one of the NASA managers uttered a phrase that went down in history as one of the worst corporate blunders ever documented. He turned to the Thiokol representatives and said, "It's time for you to take off your engineers' hats and put on your managers' hats." In other words, stop thinking about safety, think about the business. The Thiokol engineers were put on hold. The company's managers met privately, and within minutes they returned with a response different from what their own engineers had recommended. They approved the launch. Boisjoli stared at the table. He knew what that meant, but the decision was no longer his to make. The final decision wasn't technical. It was about the agenda.
At that moment, the outcome was already decided.
And now you know more than anyone watching that launch did. On the morning of January 28th, the temperature at Cape Canaveral was exactly -2 degrees. There was ice on the launch structures. Ground crews photographed icicles hanging from the launch pad rails. Some voices suggested another delay. They were dismissed. At 11:38 a.m., the Challenger lifted off. The O-rings on the lower right joint of the booster rocket, hardened by the cold, did not seal as they should have. A flame began to leak through the joint, invisible to any camera at that moment. A microscopic leak of high-pressure hot gas, directed straight at the external fuel tank. 73 seconds later, it was over. The cameras recorded the explosion, the white trail splitting across the blue Florida sky, the stands filled with families, the classrooms with the children. 7 people were there and none of them returned. The teacher who was going to teach the first class from space never made it there. The investigations that followed were long, detailed, and brutally revealing. The Rogers Commission, convened by Reagan to investigate the disaster, concluded that the technical cause was exactly what Boisjoli had predicted. The O-rings, the cold, the seal failed. The gas leaked, the tank exploded. But the commission went further. It concluded that NASA had an institutional culture that suppressed bad news, that managers made safety decisions based on schedule pressure rather than engineering data, that there was a systematic pattern of ignoring warnings that contradicted what the agency wanted to hear. Boisjoli testified before the commission. He told them everything: the memos, the conference call, the remark about the manager's hat. He showed the data he had presented months earlier. He was fired by Morton Thiokol shortly after. The company said it was for health reasons. He spent years with post-traumatic stress disorder. He knew it could have been different. He knew he had said what needed to be said, and that no one had listened. The problem wasn't the rocket, it was the decision.
Machines fail, decisions repeat.
There are certain stories the world treats as technical tragedies. It speaks of mechanical failure, of weather conditions, of imperfect engineering. It's more comfortable that way. Because if the problem is the hardware can be replaced, the system can be fixed, and the responsibility gets diluted in the metal and rubber. But when the problem is the decision, when there's a man with a report in his hand saying not to launch and the answer is to launch anyway, that's when the story gets uncomfortable. Because decisions have faces. Decisions have names. Decisions were made by people who woke up that morning, went to work, and made a choice. And 7 people who weren't part of that decision paid the price. If you want to understand how mistakes like this keep happening, sign up now, because this wasn't the last one. In the next file, the error wasn't in the hardware, it was in the code. And no one managed to stop the machine in time.